Good morning.
Good morning. I can see and hear you.
Great. The screen share looks like it's still disabled.
Yep, I just made you a co-host, so now you should be able to.
You should be able to see my title slide.
Yes, I can see it.
Great. We should be good to go then.
Morning. This is I'm Mark Blank. Today is December 26th. This is Commissioner's information meeting with Colorado Department of Health and Environment. And we're joined today by Mr. Josh Korth, who I think is going to brief us on the core voluntary emissions program. So unless my colleagues have anything else to say, I think we'll jump into our commissioner plan. Any opening remarks other than happy holidays to all?
Happy holidays and welcome, Mr. Korth.
You're muted. Commissioner Gilman.
Yeah, happy holidays, happy day after Christmas, and good to see you, Mr. Korth. Look forward to the presentation.
I think I was muted, Commissioner Plant. So go ahead, Mr. Korth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you all hear me okay?
We can.
Great. Well, I appreciate, first of all, you all taking a couple minutes here the day after Christmas, as Commissioner Gilman said, and a busy holiday season, busy year end of season for everyone. So we're going to take a couple minutes today just to talk about the core voluntary clean energy plan. It is the last of the initial 7 plans that were submitted under some earlier legislation. And I'm going to spend a couple minutes just walking through a couple of brief slides for you all and for those listening to the meeting, describing kind of where we're at in the process, where we're at with CORE's plan, and then kind of finish up with some next steps as we move forward. So appreciate, again, you all taking the time this morning. And can you all see my slides okay?
We can.
Great, thank you. So again, this, as Chairman Blank said, is a public information meeting, a commissioner information meeting regarding the voluntary clean energy plan for Core Electric Cooperative. My name is Josh Korth. I'm with the Department of Public Health and Environment. I'm a supervisor in the State Implementation Plan Technical Development Unit, and do a lot of the ongoing work with the utility sector, and specifically with the clean energy plans. We're going to walk through a little bit of the history, why we are here today. We're going to talk about the guidance and the workbook. I know you all here at the Commission are familiar with that, but for anybody listening along today, did want to just give a little bit of a brief overview of the process and the workbook and how everything works. Then we'll specifically talk about the core CEP verification and the safe harbor determination. And then we'll talk a little bit about the ongoing review as we move forward from this point, what comes next, some new reports that are required out of recent legislation for the division to develop that I think would be of potential interest to you all. And then we'll leave as much time as we need for kind of wrapping up any questions and discussion that the commissioners may have on any of the topics that we talk about today. Again, this is a consultation briefing. Part of the Clean Energy Plan process requires us at the division to consult with you all in the verification of these plans, and that's really what we're here to discuss today. So really 3 iterations of legislation is the reason that we're here today. In 2019, Senate Bill 19096 updated the inventory requirements for the state, as well as created statewide goals for us to be able to achieve with reduction of greenhouse gases. Senate Bill 19236, which I know all of you are intimately familiar with, created the Clean Energy Plan process. It required a clean energy plan from the one qualifying retail utility in Colorado, and created a pathway for voluntary filings from municipal and cooperative utilities, which is why we're here to discuss this today. And then 191261 created a safe harbor for those that had a verified and approved CEP, and it created a safe harbor from additional Air Quality Control Commission regulation that would direct further reductions or targets for utilities that have a verified CEP. That really created the framework for the Clean Energy Plan process, the mechanics of how the filings and the proceedings work with respect to those plans. What it did not do for the voluntary plans is create any type of mandated deadline by which to file a plan, or any what I'll call regulatory hook for utilities that did not file a plan. And so in 2021, as part of House Bill 21-1266, a deadline for both notifying the division that a voluntary plan would be filed and a deadline for filing was created. And it also created an ongoing tracking requirement for these voluntary plans, so that if a utility was not on track with the plan that they filed, they would have to bring an updated plan back to the Air Commission in order to get back on track, as well as make up cumulative reductions. And so that created the mechanism by which the 7, what I'll call original plans, were required. The 3 plans that go through the public utilities process for either the investor-owned utilities or the wholesale G&T utility, and then the 4 voluntary plans. We were here discussing with you about 18 months ago now the original 3 of those plans. Core Electric Cooperative did request an extension to the original filing deadline that was requested due to the ongoing proceeding for Xcel Energy that was in process at the time. And we at the division did grant that extension to December 31st of this year. And so that's why we're here right at the end of the year. Apologies again for being here in the middle of a holiday week, but there were some very unique circumstances for Core that led to that extension, given the ongoing proceedings that were before you. And then earlier this year, in Senate Bill 23-198, more transparency was created, as well as more of a robust ongoing outreach to you all, to the legislature, to the Air Commission, as to the status of these plans. Notably, the transparency that was created required us to create a process by which we held a public meeting on this plan, where we put a draft out for public review and public comment and provided written response to those comments. And so unlike the plans that we talked about back in 2022, you'll see a third appendix at the end of this plan, which is the division's written response to the comments that we received as part of that public transparency process. Additionally, of interest, I think, to you all is that there are 2 additional utilities that are likely to have to file as a result of the 2023 legislation. Those are Guzman Energy and United Power. So it created some additional requirements here this year for plans that will be filed in 2022. And really that came out of, I think, a need to understand all of the energy flow from the plans that are decided through the proceedings at the Public Utilities Commission, and the plans that are voluntary plans, and the intermediaries who are transferring power between those companies. And so as we move forward, I think we will now have a full understanding of where that energy is being generated, who it is being transferred to, either through a wholesale or a contractual requirement, and then ultimately where it is being delivered, whether that is in Colorado or outside of Colorado. And so, with these iterative looks at the Clean Energy Plan process, we continue to improve the process. We continue to fill in any gaps that are identified as we go through this with multiple utilities. And so I will just quickly pause there and see if you all have any questions about any of kind of the statutory history that got us to this conversation today.
Commissioner Plant? Commissioner Gilman?
I don't. Thank you, Mr. Corth. I recall all of it. Thank you.
Yeah, I just, and you may be taking this up later, but it sounds like in the past we had this issue where a co-op owned a coal plant, signed a wholesale contract with a unregulated third-party marketer, and all of a sudden those emissions disappeared from Colorado's accounting. And it sounds like we fixed that problem, maybe statutorily, maybe regulatorily, but who owns those emissions? Does the marketer own those emissions, or does the co-op own those emissions? And I just say it matters a ton as we try and sort through these regional market rules and the emissions tracking. So, and if you're taking that up later, fine, but I don't want to leave this conversation without some guidance.
No, I absolutely appreciate that, and you're absolutely right, Chairman. The tracking of emissions when you go from a generation-based accounting system, which is what all the federal and state regulations have historically been based on, to a sales-based accounting system, that end use of the electricity is critically important. And so we are continuing, as we've talked about previously, to have those emissions transfer with market transactions. And so if a cooperative is purchasing from a wholesale provider, in state or out of state, they are required to create an emissions intensity or get an emissions intensity of that energy that's being received from that marketer. If they're selling to a marketer, whether that be an in-state marketer, a regional market, selling directly through a contract to another utility, again, those emissions transfer with that sale so that they go, essentially, if you think about following the ledger is probably the right way to say it. They are created at the point of generation. They transfer with each transaction until they are ultimately delivered to a retail customer as part of that utility structure. And so we think that is the appropriate way to account for those emissions. We recognize that there are a lot of conversations that you all are having, that the Energy Office is having, that interregional, maybe not the right word, but regional markets are having, multiple states are having with each other. This is an area that I think we continue to engage with you all and consult with you all to make sure we have those rules of accounting defined properly, is the right way to say it, I think. Does that answer the question, or does that still leave it unanswered in your mind a little bit?
Yeah, it's still unanswered because as you allow, someone who owns a coal plant in Colorado to sign a marketing contract, perhaps without any economic import, and then the marketer sells the power out of state, somehow those emissions are magically gone in ways that may be inappropriate. And we're going to struggle with what that means in a regional market that could extend from Washington State to Colorado to southern Arizona. So I just think you got to do it both ways, generator and load, and you got to somehow find a way to reconcile them. You can't have purely a load-based way of doing it, or I think it's going to be subject to ways that manipulation that may not be intuitively appealing. So I just throw that out there because we're struggling with that in real time in ways that are causing enormous heartburn throughout the West.
I absolutely agree with you. And this is an area where, historically we have not made decisions based on the emissions. We've made it based on the energy need and the cost. And now we're adding another variable into the equation that the original design of the system was not contemplated to consider. And so, I think now that we will have a requirement for wholesale utilities to be part of that accounting, where before they were not part of that accounting ledger. I think that's the first step. I think getting regional organizations to both forecast emission intensity and then report out emission intensity of what is actually delivered is another critical step that we need to continue to have those conversations with those entities. At the end of the day, if emissions are generated in Colorado, they are part of our statewide inventory. The statewide inventory continues to be tracked on a generation-based requirement. And so if those emissions are produced in Colorado, they will be part of that accounting ledger. They will be reported out biannually in our updated inventory. They will be reported out to the legislature. And so if we see a significant leakage of emissions that are generated in state but not accounted for in the retail sales in Colorado, I think we are going to be able to identify that, and then we will have to decide what the appropriate step is to take based on that information.
I appreciate that. It just seems like somehow the generator has to be tagged with those emissions, no matter what they do on market design, market participation, and wholesale contracts, especially since it's essentially zero cost to sign a wholesale contract with no economic import other than maybe playing around with emissions. So anyway, I appreciate the dialogue. I appreciate your continued public and other discussions with us, and look forward to working with you. So
Absolutely. And we appreciate it as well. I think, when we started this journey almost 4 years ago now, none of us really kind of knew how this was going to work. It was a completely new way of thinking about things. And, I think the ongoing collaboration between, our division and your commission, the ongoing work with the regulated entities, with the environmental stakeholders, with the advocacy groups has made this a good process. We can continue to learn from it and continue to improve it, but I think all in all, it has been successful in trying to achieve what we were hoping to achieve. So
just again appreciate it, and we're in these discussions with regulators and utilities from the entire West. So
yep, I hear you.
keep going. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Maybe just to quickly step back about, how we developed the clean energy plan guidance, what our overall arching objectives were. We wanted it to be the neutral, objective, transparent verification. We wanted it to use readily available data that was collected and submitted by utilities. Probably most importantly, we wanted it to be standardized across all of the utilities that we were doing this work for. And, I think we've been successful in that third bullet point, in that all of the plans, whether they be plans that come before this commission through part of the litigated process, or plans that were submitted voluntarily, they're all playing by the same rules. And that's critically important for being able to do this in a transparent and an objective way, for the public to understand, what is going on, and for the regulated community to know what the expectations are. As Chairman Blank said, there are unresolved questions still about how do we make sure we're not allowing, for lack of a better way to describe it, a shell game to be played and just to transfer these emissions around with no meaningful action. And so we're going to talk a little bit in a couple of slides about the ongoing work that is now required by the division as a way to track how this is progressing and be able to correct course if it becomes necessary. The statutory guidelines that we were given were not always consistent. There were some undefined things left there. I think we resolved most of them through the Clean Energy Plan guidance and through the workbook, and then through these other legislative actions that have been taken in 2021 and 2023. We've tried to close any gaps that were identified as still being important. And so just wanted to, again, just remind everybody of kind of the process that we used and why we landed where we did. The methodology for the workbook and for the guidance, it's a single published guidance published by the division in early 2021. We define what the input data is. We create pick lists that are designed from a most specific to least specific order and direct the utilities to use the most specific data available to them. We define emission factors and conversion constants, and we pre-populate all the equations. And so the math is done the same by everybody. Because of the statutory differences in whether it's a CO2 based calculation or a total GHG based calculation, we calculated them both. For the plan that we're talking about today, the voluntary plan by CORE, the determination of whether they've achieved that goal in their planning process and whether or not they've qualified for the safe harbor is based on the total GHG emissions. And then again, we calculate reductions based on total Colorado sales. So to Chairman's blank comment earlier, all generation within the state, whether that is sold to the retail customers or sold to a wholesaler or through a contract to another utility, all of those emissions are part of the workbook. What ultimately gets assigned to the retail portion does take into account those transactions that we were talking about earlier, where those emissions flow with the transaction if it is sold through a contract or to a wholesaler. And then what you end up with at the end is the emissions that are remaining associated with the retail sales by that utility. So again, the verification is confirming that all the statutory thresholds are achieved. This is determined initially by the utility when they create the workbook. And then we go through and essentially transfer all of that data into a clean workbook so that we can ensure the integrity of the workbook is maintained, the calculations are performed properly, all of the generation that is part of the modeling performed by the utility is included in the workbook. And then we verify that 2005 baseline from the historical data and the 2030 projections based on the plan, the modeling that is done for the plan that is submitted by the utility. As I noted earlier, the legislation earlier this year now requires us to hold a public meeting, which we did on the 18th. We had a couple of participants in that meeting. I think we had about 15 originally registered. I think about 8 showed up for the meeting. There were some verbal dialogue around the modeling that was performed by CORE, and then that was reflected in the written comments that were submitted by Sierra Club to us on the 19th. We responded to those written comments. We added an attachment to this report with those written comments so that you all could see how we responded to the questions that were raised. And then we're here for the PUC consultation that is required under the 2019 legislation before we do a final verification of the plan. So at the conclusion of today's conversation, we'll take any feedback that you all have for us on this plan. We'll incorporate that into a final version of our verification report, and then we'll submit that final version into the informational docket. And then CORE will submit their plan along with their board approval letter into the docket. And once they have made that submission, the 2019 legislation says that is deemed approved upon receipt into that docket. So we are proposing to verify that CORE's plan will achieve that 80% reduction from the 2005 levels in 2030. As noted in the public comment, there is essentially no room for margin in CORE's plan to achieve that 2030 target. And we're going to talk on the next slide about how we are going to ensure they remain on track. We attached our draft verification report in the materials that we provided to you all. We submitted that draft verification report into the informational docket on Friday of last week, and are having the conversation today. And we do propose to verify that upon submission of Corps' plan, that they will achieve that safe harbor from Air Commission regulation through 2030. And note that, with this plan, they're essentially committing publicly to this trajectory to get to that 2030 level. I'll have a slide at the very end of this that shows the resource mix that they're projecting when they get out to 2030. And it is a notable transformation from, very coal intensive in 2005. Obviously, they still have ownership share of Comanche 3 at the current time. But as they move out from the Public Service Company of Colorado contract, as Comanche 3, starts to near retirement towards the end of the decade, they're essentially replacing all of that energy need with majority wind, solar, battery, and a little bit of peaking backup in order to meet reliability needs as the system requires. So this is just
sorry, Mr. Corth, I had a quick question. We're looking at this relative to a 2005 baseline. Obviously, Comanche 3 came on after 2005. I'm just curious, how does the 2005 core baseline compare with, say, a state average baseline or a PSCO baseline? Is it essentially the same as the PSCO baseline in 2005?
It is essentially the same. The resource mix came, I believe, almost exclusively from Piasco with a very minor share from WAPA. When we did the calculations, I noted in the report that the baseline that was carved out of the Public Service Company of Colorado baseline, because Corps had already announced that they would no longer be a customer in 2030. So they were required to deduct that amount out of their original baseline. It is the core baseline is slightly higher by about 0.8%. One of the things we identified in the Clean Energy Plan process is that we were not going to be able to fully reconcile every single ton of emissions looking back historically almost 20 years. And so our intention was to minimize any potential overlap in these various filed plans to avoid double counting. And I think we've been able to achieve that in this evaluation.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Absolutely. And as I talk about this slide, again, kind of circling back to what Chairman Blank noted earlier, Corps in their workbook applied a system rate to any market sales. And that was a system rate based on all of the generation assets. And the way that it worked out in the math, they anticipate likely buying from the SPP market or the WEC market in 2030 for any market purchases. And the market purchases came in at the defined rate of 450 pounds of CO2 per net megawatt. What they were selling into the market based on their own resource mix in 2030 was about 210. And so if you remember, one of the big criticisms 18 months ago was that contract for those Comanche 3 emissions was essentially a wind swap agreement. They were giving them away without taking that carbon into effect. This plan does treat all market sales as the system mix, which would include both Comanche and renewable energy that is part of the portfolio. And that's why you end up with a sales intensity that is lower than the intensity of what they are planning to purchase in 2030. And so, I think we did learn from the last time we were here talking with you that, selling off full coal-fired energy, replacing it with zero carbon energy and not treating that as a system average is not the way people want to see that done. And I would note that Core does not have the same type of contract that we talked about previously. And so, they are treating sales as their system average, which I believe is consistent with how the majority of the plans that you all have looked at have been treating it as well. And so, we do think the accounting was handled appropriately given the contracts that are in place, given that there will be sales and purchases into a market, and it does result in an 80% reduction by 2030 for this cooperative.
Just again, let me keep pushing a little bit more at that. So it still sounds like a problem if you have a potential problem if you have 100%. So you have a utility-owned coal plant, they sign a wholesale contract. So instead of getting tagged for 100% of the emissions of the owned coal plant, they're just getting tagged for the system average of the wholesale market. But even that may be problematic because it's still a way to avoid your full responsibility. I agree it's better than allowing 100% to disappear and be replaced by 100% new without changing system dispatch in any way. So there's definitely progress. But isn't that still a problem that you can have an owned coal plant and shift from those emissions down to the system average without changing anything in the real world?
I'm not sure because I think we have to recognize that there are market dynamics. There are a need for these transactions to both address cost, address reliability, to address weather issues. It's a dynamic system. And so I think it is much more appropriate, whether or not it is the full solution, to look at a system average and create an intensity from what I'll call that average normalized energy that has been either transacted into or transacted from the market on an annual basis. We are not in a position yet where we can really track in real time the intensity of the system. That's where we need to get to in the future, to have this full process, might be the right word, to translate generation-based accounting to retail sales-based accounting. There's still that gap in data that we need to continue to work to improve. And in doing that, then we start to be able to say, in near real time, what energy was I getting? What energy was I selling? What emissions were being produced at this point in time? Instead of looking at it, an annualized kind of backward looking approach that we're still, I don't want to say stuck in because that's not the right word, but it's still a challenge is probably the right way to describe it.
Well, I mean, we will have data on the actual emissions from individual generation plants, and we know who owns them.
Yep.
So and I mean, I get it. There may be wholesale contracts with real economics to it, but there also can be wholesale contracts that change absolutely nothing in the real world other than shifting emissions from an owned plant to the system average, which again is way better than shifting it from an owned coal plant to 100% wind. But again, as we go through the regional markets discussion and figure out how to do this, I still think it's problematic to allow a specified resource like an owned coal plant to shift to system average simply by signing a wholesale contract where there's no visibility into the economics behind that contract. And look, I mean, for Core, this coal plant's going to retire by 2031 anyway. So it's only a year. So, I mean, this isn't a federal, this isn't a giant issue here. because it's only like a year difference. But as we set up these regional markets, we just got to get it right, or it will be a shell game. And the start to it is I think, has to be on the own generation as a specified resource. So again, we won't get buried here on board, but please help us not turn these wholesale markets into a shell game that avoids any accountability or responsibility, because there's no transparency into these wholesale contracts, and it's so easy to sign a contract that has no economic import. So just
Yeah, and I
plea to help us
I
without
absolutely I
trying to mess up
absolutely
this.
agree with you that this is a critical issue to continue to maintain. The other thing I will say is that as you look at the math, selling at a system average, which is substantially lower than the emission rate of the coal unit, does prevent the majority of those emissions from leaving the calculation. So if for this example, if Core were to sell the Comanche 3 resource at the generator rate, that's going to be close to 2,000 pounds of CO2 per net megawatt hour, as opposed to the 210 that they are selling at their system average. And so this is, I think, the best way mathematically to deal with it right now. And I fully agree with you that we need to continue to make this more robust, more transparent as we move forward.
Wasn't there something in the recent legislation that shifted from a load-based approach to a generator-based approach?
We are not sure what might come in this next legislative session.
No. In the last one in 2023, wasn't there language forcing us to shift to a generator-based approach instead of a load-based approach?
I do not believe so. At least not in the context of the clean energy plans as they're currently constructed. I believe there were a number of things that required additional modeling, but did not actually change the way that this math works. I think we are anticipating there will be some additional legislation that likely flows out of some of the work that the Energy Office is currently working on with their Ascent Analytics study. Also the requirement now for the wholesale utilities to participate if they meet a certain sales threshold within the state. I think that is going to give us that missing piece of getting from generator through wholesaler to retail sales. And so we're making progress. We're not perfect yet. I'm not going to stand here and say we are, but I think we're making good progress.
Thanks. Keep going, sir.
Yeah, no problem. So I want to talk just for a minute or two about the ongoing review process, and this has been strengthened over the last couple of legislative sessions. So back coming out of the 2019 legislation, we established a direct reporting of emissions for utilities. This requires them to provide to us all operating fossil generation resources in the state. And that data is then used as part of the data to establish our biannual GHG inventory. And so the majority operator or majority owner, who's typically the operator of those units, has to report all of the emissions from those units and has to tell us who the co-owners of those units are and what their co-ownership percentage is, so that we understand who is responsible for those generation-based emissions. We then compare that with the annual reporting of the CEP data, which is, again, that retail-based data, to make sure all of those generation emissions are being fed into the start of the calculation process. In 2021, the legislation established that the interim year projections that are part of the initial Clean Energy Plan filing, the division has to track progress against those interim year values for all the voluntary plans. And if utility is off track 2 consecutive years from those interim year targets, they have to come back through the Air Commission with an updated plan that not only achieves the 2030 target, but also makes up any missed reductions in those interim years. And so there's now a verification or a feedback loop that didn't exist at the beginning of this process, by which we are evaluating the progress of these plans and ensuring we remain on track. We also now have a statutory obligation at the division in 2027 to look at all these voluntary plans and ensure that they are going to have the resources necessary by 2030 in order to meet that 2030 end goal. And if they do not have those resources necessary, we can then require them to come back with a new plan to get those resources in place. In 2024, we also have a report to the Air Commission and to the legislature, I believe, on who is required to file a clean energy plan under any of the 3 series of legislation. And so we had the original 3 that are going through your processes with their proceedings. We had the 3 in 2022 that were submitted as voluntary plans, and the 1 today. So we have 7 to date that we have gone through the verification work on, and are expecting 2 more at a minimum next year, those being Guzman Energy and United Power. In our 2024 report, the division has to look at all of the 2022 sales for all utilities across the state, municipal, cooperative, and determine if any additional plans will be required to be filed. And I believe it's a 300,000 megawatt threshold that we are evaluating all of those 2022 sales on for those additional utilities to determine if any of them met that minimum sales obligation and would be required to file. They may already be part of an additional filing or a filing that has already occurred. And so we will have a report that we put out. I believe it's due in September or October. I don't have the date immediately in front of me, to the Air Commission, and we provide that to the legislature about any additional plans that have to be filed. And those have to be filed by the end of 2024, verified by the end of 2025. And so I have a feeling that is information that you all would be likely interested in as part of this broader conversation of what's going on within the state. And I would recommend that we come back before you sometime next year as we're either developing that report or when we're ready to present it to the Air Commission and provide that information to you all as part of this ongoing conversation.
That'd be great. Thank you.
And then likewise in 2027, when we have prepared that report about the resources of all the voluntary plans and having adequate resources, in the pipeline to be able to meet that 2030 goal, I think that would be another good opportunity to, not that we won't have many other opportunities to talk, but another good opportunity to come back and share that information publicly with you all. As I mentioned, CORE has interim year targets. So these will be the targets against which they're measured to make sure that they are making progress. As you all are familiar, they're leaving the PUC contract here in 2025. The future of Comanche 3 is going to be determined over the coming years through various proceedings and legal actions and other things. And so, what we see is after they leave the PUC contract, they start making a pretty deep and meaningful reduction in their carbon emissions, leading to 2030. Oops. And then finally, I'll just leave this slide as kind of the last slide before I open it up to any additional questions and comments and discussion that you all might have. But, I think this is the meaningful market transformation that we are expecting to see in Colorado, going from a very coal and gas intensive system. Historically, we're in the midst of that transition now to a system that is primarily wind, solar, batteries, some market purchases, some peaking gas, when we get to 2030 and beyond. And so, I think as you look at the 2026 through 2030 years, you see a very significant ramp up in what they are going to be contracting for wind and solar assets within Colorado for their system. They do not operate any of their own resources. It's all through contracts and through market purchases. And, I think we see, a commitment to transforming their system and delivering, low carbon energy to their customers as we look towards the end of the decade. And, this is the type of meaningful and significant transformation that, we at the division are expecting to see from all of the utilities in Colorado. And, as I mentioned on the prior slide, we have a obligation to track that progress, to check in with them and with you on the progress being made over the next 7 years, to ensure that we get to that level of reduction in 2030. And with that, I'll turn it over to you all and see what types of questions or discussion or comments you all might have.
Commissioner Plant, you want to comments, questions, or anywhere you want to go?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And this is really interesting, and I appreciate the briefing. Could you go back to that previous slide? I'm just wondering what I know that they put in place the plan and get it approved, and that exempts them from various different regulations and things like that. They have they're increasing actually their coal, immediately between 24 and 25 up till 26, and then they start sort of the big construction, and that there's a pretty significant growth in those resources over those next 3-4 years, and I'm wondering, what are the sort of enforcement mechanisms if for some reason they don't, some of these contracts fall through, or various different things happen that that don't enable them to achieve that level of emission reduction? What are the consequences of that?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that question. And so, as I mentioned, the immediate consequence, if they were not to be on track over these next couple of years, is that the Air Quality Control Commission, through regulation, can require them to bring back an updated clean energy plan that, one, has to hit the 2030 targets, but then two, also has to make up any cumulative reductions that were missed in these near-term years. And so the practical implication of that is that if they miss in these first couple of years, they would have to speed up the implementation of those wind and solar resources towards the end of the decade in order to make up those cumulative reductions.
Okay, thanks. So you have sort of an annual, sort of look back and say, okay, where are you relative to your plan? And then there's a corrective action that's put in place.
That's exactly right. By statute, the division is required to track progress against these interim years. And if they miss 2 consecutive years, they are then obligated to bring a plan back through an Air Quality Control Commission rule to hit the 2030 targets and make up any missed reductions that they've missed along the way.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Goman, questions, comments, thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Korth. Appreciate it. And on this slide, looking at this, when I look at the coal line, that's essentially the Unit 3 in Pueblo, right? Because any other coal is baked into the PSCO purchases, right?
Correct.
Okay, so I don't have off the top of my head, but does the trajectory here of the coal kind of decline post 2025 track with also essentially what Public Service is planning for the declines in operation of that plant under the settlement of their phase 1 ERP process?
That is correct. It does trend with the reduction in capacity factor in the phase one settlement. I will note that it is, as we get out to the out years in 2028, 2029, slightly lower than that maximum capacity that PSCO had been projecting. They modeled it that way for a couple of reasons. One, to make sure that they had in the pipeline the resources they were going to need by 2030 in order to replace that resource when it does permanently retire. And two, kind of based on their historical operation and their historical deliveries from that unit, and those deliveries not typically meeting that maximum amount that they are obligated or entitled to by contract. And so they modeled it with a slightly lower capacity factor, which leads to a slightly lower emissions, which makes their interim year targets actually more difficult to achieve if that unit were to operate closer to its maximum available capacity. And so they will have to manage that. They will have to ensure that they are still hitting their interim year targets, but modeled it this way in order for the model to show and to select renewable resources coming into the portfolio in time for that retirement.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. And then looking at the top line, the net retail load, as I understand in this table, that's showing us essentially gigawatt hours projected of retail need or retail sales by year.
Correct.
Is there any kind of verification on how that tracks with anticipation of uptick in electrification of things like vehicles or heating? It looks to be just below a 2% increase year over year for much of that projection. And just curious, if you all do any verification or if they explain in their larger plan kind of how that comports with other state policy objectives regarding electrification.
Yeah, so they do discuss it in their narrative. Nothing in the implementing legislation gives the division, the Air Commission, or you all the ability to approve, deny, modify the plans that they have modeled and their board has approved. Their annualized growth is slightly higher over the next 7 years than it has been historically. Again, don't have the numbers right in front of me, but it's in their narrative. I believe it's 2.3, 2.4% annualized growth as opposed to the last 5 years, which was closer to 1.5%. And that is due to an uptick in EVs, a slight uptick in electrified appliances. It does incorporate growth into retail distributed generation as well. And so they do see some of the growth in electrification offset by the growth in retail distributed generation at the consumer level as well.
Okay, that's helpful. And essentially, since these plans are done, essentially on kind of a bulk system quantity, if they did happen to see electrification that causes demands to be faster or bigger, those would essentially have to be made up by carbon-free sources, right, in order to keep the bottom line math the same.
That's absolutely correct. Any additional growth beyond what they modeled would have to be essentially zero carbon resources for that entire delta in order to maintain that mass emissions trajectory on an annual level.
Okay. Two other questions.
Yeah.
So essentially what I'm hearing from you is the safe harbor that we see in statute is essentially contingent upon their performance under this plan. And given this kind of check-in situation that that your division has, the safe harbor is not necessarily guaranteed if they're not performing under the plan.
That's correct.
Okay. And then last question, is there a more, and apologies if I missed it, is there a more detailed kind of plan or document that is available to us through your files to look at some of the detail, that supports what's here?
Yeah, so included as attachment B to our report is about a 20-page narrative that they put together on the development of their plan, the future resources that they are planning to contract with. A couple of the names in there are redacted because the final details of the contract are still being worked out for some of the solar, some of the gas backup units. Unlike what you all see in your proceedings, those hourly modeling files and all the detailed modeling work is only summarized in their narrative, aggregated up to the annual level to essentially provide the underlying data for this table. So you probably will not see quite the same level of detail that you're accustomed to in your proceedings. But they did roll up all of their modeling work, describe how they ran their models in that narrative.
And Mr. Court, just for my clarification, and the listening public, if we have them the day after Christmas, those are in your files, like in a proceeding at CDPHE, or are these housed anywhere in PUC files? Just so myself.
So they are housed in. Yeah, they are housed in the report that I submitted into the informational docket. It is Appendix B of that document. We also posted our draft report, the draft native file workbook to our website when we put out our draft report. We put out a various number of constant contact email notifications that those files were available, that the public comment period was open. They are on our, and I can maybe drop the link in the chat if you want it, but they're on our climate change webpage of CDPHE is where we put those out there publicly before we held our public meeting and before we submitted that file into the informational docket in preparation for this consultation meeting.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Those are my only questions, Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Gilman. Well, first, just appreciate your leadership and your willingness to engage a dialogue with us on these issues. And just as one of the outcomes of the consultation process, I just request that you continue to explore the shift to generation-based accounting with specified paths as you go forward. So there's again, it's not like I'm beating up on wholesale contracts. It's just as you shift to markets, people are going to be able to escape or not going to. If you don't base it on own generation, you're not going to be able to follow it, and everything's going to go to the system average in ways that can create all kinds of perverse incentive over new generation choices. So just partly a thanks to you for the progress that's been made since the last time we did this, and a plea and a request in the formal consultation, hopefully to be included in your record in this, to continue the shift towards anchoring emissions in owned resources with own generation and contracted power. Just the load side of it gets really, what do you call it? A shell game. Squirrely is the word I've been using, because there's just no way to tie the load back to the sink as you go to these regional markets. So a plea and a formal request in the consultation to do that.
I think very much top of mind for us, and I think we also want to be very conscious of the flip side of that coin, and that is, we have states neighboring us that are very coal heavy, and we don't want them operating those resources at significant capacities to feed our retail load either. And so, we're trying to balance both sides of that coin and make sure that the math is both fair but also accurate in what we are achieving. I think that's the end goal that we're all trying to achieve. And your points are well taken, that we don't want resources operated that don't serve the need for those retail customers just because they can make some money on them. That doesn't help the end game. And so, we have a lot less control over that part of the equation. But if we are being very conscious, very thoughtful, very transparent in how the math works for the emissions, and we're tying it back to our statewide goals, which again are based on generation emissions and in-state emissions from those fossil units, I think we can navigate the path in an appropriate way.
Well, like I say, just appreciate your willingness to listen and, evolve this over time. And, when you see what's going on in these regional markets where, you have all this deeming that's starting to divorce itself from actual dispatch, it's just, there's a lot of risk of game playing, and you just got to tie the accounting as best as you can, both to generation and load, and sort through it in real time. And we'll do our best on our side to get you the data you need, and just continue the dialogue. So
I absolutely appreciate the dialogue. And I think something that somebody a long time ago told me, that one of my coworkers, is you start with the sphere of control. You start with the things you have direct control over, and you use that to be influential to the next level. And so I think that's really where we are right now, trying to find that next step from what we have direct control over into what we can influence in the bigger conversation.
Well, and you have your levers of control. We have our levers of control, and we just got to work together to make sure it's transparent, accurate, fair, and not subject to manipulation. And that's why this consultation is so useful, and why strong supporter of the ongoing dialogue. So
absolutely, we feel absolutely the same way. It's been a tremendous working relationship with you all, and something that we are really looking forward to continuing as we move forward.
All right. Well, let me just check with my colleagues. Are you okay if this generator to sync comments is part of the official consultation coming out of this Commissioner Plant?
I am.
Commissioner Goman?
Yeah, thanks.
All right. So that can be on behalf of the PUC now.
So what I would propose to do is maybe add a quick, what I'll call, informational piece to the third appendix at the end of the public comments, to note that this is part of the ongoing conversation and something that we intend to continue moving forward, to make sure that we are not leaving emissions unaccounted for in our math.
Yeah, it's not even just unaccounted for. It's like not appropriately allocated to the source of those emissions.
Yep.
So I think you're doing way better on not letting emissions disappear. But I still think there's issues about how they're allocated and accounted for, and who gets tagged, in ways that perhaps we can continue to improve on over time. So.
Yeah, and I guess the other piece I would say is, I think we will want to and need to open up this guidance document and this workbook again in the near future, either as a result of legislation or as a result from the 2023 requirement to look at modeling a 2027 year against a target reduction. And so engaging with you all as we reopen that stakeholder process and that comment process to find out ways to improve would be a logical next step, is probably the right thing to say.
And we'll need your help on these regional markets. So to be continued.
To be continued.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks to my colleagues and the team here for doing this the day after Christmas. And with that, I hope everybody continues to have a enjoyable holiday. So thanks all.
Thank you all. Appreciate the time today.
You too.